All right, great.
Okay. I'm excited to introduce to you Marianne Comfort. Marianne serves in several positions. Her work is so widespread and multifaceted that I actually have to read them. She's a member of the board of the Laudato Si movement. The movement's mission is to inspire and mobilize the Catholic community to care for our common home and achieve climate and ecological justice. She's a member of the justice team of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. She coordinates engagement in the areas of earth, anti-racism, and women. She's a member of the steering committee of the Catholic Climate Covenant. This organization encourages ecological conversion and action to promote climate justice and integral ecology. The Vatican has asked this network to lead the US implementation of the Laudato Si action platform. And Marianne is chair of the Interreligious Working Group on Extractive Industries. This group is a Washington, DC based coalition of faith, human rights, and environmental organizations concerned about the negative impact of extractive industries on creation, which includes both human and the natural world. Marianne inspires us by showing us it is possible, particularly in the Washington, DC area, for women and their parishes to help make progress on ecological and social justice issues at the local, national, and international levels. She also shows us that she and other women are playing a leadership role in advancing these issues, in part by working with allies in Catholic networks and structures. Marianne also has had a fascinating faith journey, including but not limited to going from a journalist to an activist. And if time permits, perhaps she can tell us a little bit about that. Today, Marianne's going to speak about Indigenous peoples, because this is Indigenous Peoples Days and respect for the earth. And we will open up the floor for discussion and questions after her presentation. In the meantime, as usual, please put your questions in the chat, and please remember to mute when you're not speaking to avoid feedback. So, Marianne, turn the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Wow, you really added a lot more to the brief details I sent you. So thank you for that introduction. That was really lovely. And I'm going to be speaking to you from all those different roles that were mentioned. We're going to start with a prayer. So let me get situated here. So I don't know if any of you have seen the Laudato Si prayer book, but the Laudato Si movement several months ago put together a prayer book, and it has prayers from around the world connected with all different kinds of prayers for activism, for creation, for there's even a Stations of Cross. It's this beautiful prayer book. So I recommend that too. And I'm going to share this prayer from Amy Echeverria, who is the coordinator for justice, peace, and integral ecology for the missionary, for the Columbans. And she happens to be a neighbor, just lives a couple streets from me in Silver Spring, Maryland. So let us share this prayer. God of life, you love the universe into being. Let us give praise. You embrace the world without distinction. Let us give thanks. You call humanity to make flesh your tenderness. Let us live accordingly. You endow all creation with your divine beauty and wisdom. Let us acknowledge. You forgive all trespasses. Let us learn your ways. You grace us unconditionally. Let us receive humbly. You are our hope. Let us remember. Amen. And I wanted to start with that prayer because I think, when I'm talking about our work, the Sisters of Mercy and the Laudato Si movement, the Catholic Climate Covenant, I always want to start with what we're working to protect, the beauty of our natural environment, and with whom we are doing this protection, which is our Indigenous sisters and brothers. So I happened upon this photo of my husband and his nephew walking along the beach of Cape May, New Jersey, which is a favorite spot of being in nature. And then we have our sister, Tita Lopez, who I'll talk to you about a little later, is engaging with Nagobi people in Panama in defending their territory and their environment. So starting with this kind of caring for creation and remembering what we are caring for and with whom we are doing the caring and the protecting. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we care for creation through solidarity and accompaniment, particularly with Indigenous communities. And as Sisters of Mercy, we've really been deepening our work in this arena over the last 6 years at this point. Where back in 2022, we had our chapter, which is the big governance meeting for religious congregations. And our sisters from Central and South America came to that meeting and were really challenging us to think about the harms of extractive industries that they were seeing on their communities. They were seeing the impacts of mining, of oil and gas exploration, of mega dams, big hydroelectric dams that are changing ecosystems and really harming Indigenous communities. And they're really challenging the Sisters of Mercy to think about, like, how could we think about divestment and how could we think of other forms of solidarity with these communities in protecting Earth, our common home. So out of that chapter meeting, we had what we called our chapter recommitment. And part of this, we came up with the statement around hearing the cry of our suffering world. And we then kind of noted all the different ways that we want to respond to that suffering world, namely the impoverishment of peoples, the devastation of Earth, and the oppressive social norms and systems. And one of the things that we committed to acting around was pursuing education and action against practices of extractive industries that are destroying people, communities, and Earth. So it would have been back in June of 2017, the statement came out and was promoted throughout the community. And then we were called to how do we live this out? And so the leadership initially embarked on a series of listening sessions to hear the experiences of sisters throughout our congregation around this question of extractivism and extractive industries. So we traveled to Lima, Peru, and we heard from our sisters in Central and South America about the ways that their communities were experiencing the harms of extractive industries. Then we met in Belmont, North Carolina, just outside Charlotte, and we heard from sisters in the United States, the Philippines, and Guam about the ways that they are seeing the impacts of extractive industries. We actually made a field trip. We went to Duke Energy power plant and saw where they were storing the coal ash on the property. And then we heard from people who were linking the extraordinary percentages of cancers in their neighborhood and linking it to the storage of coal ash in these ponds. So we really immersed ourselves in these experiences. But we realized that only a small number of people were participating in this. And we were really thinking, like, how do we expand this to the greater Mercy world? So Sisters of Mercy, the Americas, were in the US, throughout Central and South America, the Philippines, Guam, and Jamaica, and the Caribbean. So the end of last year, we embarked on a 5-month theological reflection process, which we called Awakening to a New Consciousness. And we engaged about 300 sisters, lay associates, co-workers, and others connected with the Sisters of Mercy, a very intensive process of doing a lot of our own individual reading, watching videos, and then engaging in small group conversations. So we all were in small groups that traveled together over 5 months of meeting and conversing over the materials that we had. And I will share in the chat in a little bit the link to that page. We have all kinds of resources. It walks you through the 5 sessions we had and all kinds of resources for anyone who would like to delve into that a little more. But I'm just going to give you an overview of that process to give you a sense of this really quite remarkable work that a group of people put together for our community and for anyone else who would like to engage in this. So we really wanted to center people who are most impacted, who are most harmed by extractive industries, and the whole development model that really elevates extractivism. And the whole notion of our whole economy built on extracting resources from the ground, extracting labor, going back to slavery, and now to the labor of folks who toil in mines and so forth. So really a broad sense of what this extracting resources from the ground, how that's impacting our environment, our whole planet, and particularly communities disproportionately Indigenous and Black and Brown communities. So we had this kind of circle that we worked with, starting with deep listening, that we're going to deeply listen to these stories of communities that are most harmed by extractivism and extractive industries, and then moved into deep reflection and that social analysis of what we are seeing and hearing. And then we applied some theological lenses to help us explore that more deeply. And then we moved into the final part of this process, which was deep transformation. How do we move into a life in harmony, in interrelatedness to people's communities and earth? And I'm just going to unpack each of those kind of movements here for us. In the deep listening, we really came up with some resources that told the stories of Indigenous communities, Black communities, people of color, who are really grappling and struggling with the harms of extractive industries, be it the pollution of the water, the destruction of livelihoods, the destruction of their very culture, as the environment in which they thrive is forever changed because of these extractive industries. We've listened to the stories of community leaders who have been speaking out, and they've been criminalized, imprisoned, and even we heard from loved ones of those who've been assassinated. Some of you may have heard of Berta Cáceres, who was an Indigenous leader from Honduras, who several years ago was killed for her very outspoken work against the dam in Honduras. And the trial, had a trial of the men who actually killed her, but there continues to be investigation into the masterminds, the actual leaders, the people who called for her assassination. We also heard about communities that have been displaced from their land. And we did have some kind of gender analysis about the particular impact on women. And then we really were forced to look at the visible environmental violence, looking at the rivers that were stagnant, the mountains that are blown up to go after open pit mines. And then, of course, there's also the invisible harms which people carry in their bodies as far as public health impacts, the loss of culture when they no longer have this land, this water, which to do the rituals, and the loss of livelihoods, be it farming, fishing. So it was the deep listening, really centering these communities and hearing from them. Then we moved into the deep reflection. And as part of that, we applied a few different theological lenses to help us delve more deeply. And among them is, of course, Laudato Si. And we looked at what some of the main themes of Laudato Si are that speak to the harms of a development model that puts at the forefront extracting of resources, extracting of labor, and does not center people and Earth, our common home. We also looked at an ecofeminism lens with Yvonne Gabarra, and looking at what are the feminine aspects of how we think about our communion with each other and with our natural environment. And then we looked at eco-liberation, which is kind of a follower to liberation theology, adding an ecological component that not only is there a preferential option for those made poor, but there's also a preferential option for Earth herself. And how does looking at these three lenses and other lenses really help us to more deeply engage beyond the stories, but understanding the whole philosophy and whole mindset and even theology that causes us to think about being able to exploit our community members, our sisters and brothers, and our very home, Earth. And then finally, we moved into the deep transformation, and we had to be very careful in talking to our mostly US audience that we are not moving into action. That's the first thing we do from our Western viewpoint is what can we do? Okay, let's go organize an advocacy campaign, but still no, let's keep centered. Let's, let go of that mindset and let's stay centered in the communities that are most harmed and trying to understand more deeply how can we see things, how are we seeing things differently now? And what does that lead us to? How are we different now after we've gone through this process? How do we continue to center the voices of people most impacted? How do we engage with each other around these issues? And how do we use our individual, communal, and corporate voices to awaken our world? So we are moving into our next chapter in April of next year, April 2023. And these will be some of the questions that we'll have there. It's again, continuing the conversation that after many of us participated in this process and others are going to be engaging in it over the next few months, how does that shape the decision-making that we make when we come together in April? How do we live out more deeply the chapter recommitment from 5.5 years ago? At that point, it'll be 6 years ago. And how do we move forward and thinking about aligning our investments with our values in our education and with our advocacy. So that's an overview of the process that we embarked on, which is very exciting. And again, I will put in the chat the website for anyone who would like to look at it further. And I'd like to shift a little into, well, how have we over these 5.5 years tried to start moving into this? So we had this process for sure, but of course that didn't stop us from thinking, how do we do solidarity and accompaniment? So I want to share with you 3 examples of how we've seen this lived out and how we might all think about our engagement and solidarity and accompaniment with communities that are most harmed by extractive industries, which are mostly indigenous communities when we're talking about the actual extraction of natural resources. We find that in the US, Black and Brown communities are most harmed by the processing. Like when we talk about the petrochemical facilities in Cancer Alley of Louisiana. Some of you may have had the privilege of listening to Sharon Levine from Rise St. James. And so a lot of the harms from power plants, from the actual processing of petroleum and so forth is often in more urban centers or rural centers around petrochemical plants, and then the actual extraction of the resources before it's then processed is often right on or near indigenous lands. So the three examples I want to share with you. The first one is Sister Tita Lopez. She's the one on the right with the kind of hat, the floppy hat. And she is in Panama, and she spent about 10 years in solidarity, which continues with the Nagobi people up in the highlands of Panama. And she had been engaging with them in her ministry, and they started getting greatly concerned about a company that wanted to dam up the river on which they depended for their livelihood, for their very sustenance, and for their spiritual traditions. And so what ensued was a several-year process of resistance, of advocacy, and at points Sister Tita was there in solidarity, listening to them, and in points she was actually serving as a go-between between the community and the company in question and the Panamanian government, trying to make sure that the Nagobi people's concerns were heard by the company and the country. Unfortunately, the dam was built, the river was dammed up, and now Sister Tita is documenting the human rights abuses that are occurring. The people were displaced. They no longer have even the land on which they used to live. They are now living displaced, as you can see, and they're in an encampment. Many of them have refused to relocate. They said this is their land and they are going to stay, even though there's very little infrastructure for them anymore. They can no longer fish in this dammed up, now that the river was dammed up. And so Sister Tita is now visiting with them with some human rights lawyers and documenting this loss of livelihood, documenting some of the violence that had taken place as the community was resisting, and trying to put together a case for the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which is here in Washington, D.C., and just documenting to try to see if the community can get some compensation for the losses that they've suffered, whether it's from the company or from the government of Panama. So in this case, accompaniment and solidarity is a multi-year process of just being with the people, ensuring that they have a voice, that others are listening and sharing their story. And we here in the United States have joined Sister Tita occasionally by going to the U.S. State Department. When she was in the U.S. at one point, we set up some meetings so she could talk to some officials at the U.S. State Department who are responsible for an area including Panama. And we've welcomed some of the community members when they've come to DC to do advocacy and met with them and just offered hospitality and letting them know that the Sisters of Mercy are listening to them. We've also signed on to a statement. There was a petition to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission asking that they hear this case, and we were one of the groups that signed on in support of hearing that case. And there was actually a hearing before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission on this case. So this is the one example I wanted to share about ways of solidarity. The other one is a much shorter term kind of form of solidarity and accompaniment. And this goes back to early in 2021, when we're starting to hear about the resistance to the Line 3 pipeline, which is a Canadian company named Enbridge, was constructing a pipeline through land that's very close to the headwaters of the Mississippi River. And the Abenishanabe peoples, particularly women, Indigenous women leaders, were really speaking out and getting louder and louder. They had actually had several years of resisting this pipeline, and they had pretty much exhausted all their options through the state of Minnesota. And so they recognized that their last potential avenue was to get the Biden administration to stop the pipeline. So back in early June of 2021, they asked people of faith to come to northern Minnesota and join them to pray along the route of the pipeline. So Green Faith and some other faith organizations organized a delegation. And there were about 200 of us that traveled to northern Minnesota. And we did indeed pray with Indigenous elders along the Mississippi where the pipeline was going to be crossing. We also participated in the Treaty Peoples Gathering, which was a much bigger gathering of activists who came to northern Minnesota in advance of doing some very disruptive civil disobedience. People chained themselves to the equipment that Enbridge was using and did some very disruptive, high impact civil disobedience. But those of us who were people of faith, we were really invited to come and pray and give witness. But at this Treaty People gathering, we were really educated in the whole concept of treaties. And they were really telling us about how we all are treaty people. Treaties are the highest level of law in a country, in between countries, and that any of us who are US citizens are party to treaties because our government has entered into a treaty with the government of the Indigenous communities. So we are really educated in all about treaties. And one of the things that really stuck with me is the whole concept of, in a lot of these treaties, the Anishinaabe people were granted the right to hunt and to fish and to harvest their wild rice, which has a very spiritual connotation to them. And they were telling us that, yes, and these treaties do indeed grant those rights, and they are using those rights. But they're saying with the pipeline and other fossil fuel infrastructure, what good are those rights if we can no longer fish and use the fish if the wet water is polluted? How can we harvest our rice if the water and the wild rice plants are polluted? How can we hunt if our land is polluted? And just being there was so remarkable because you could just see this land, which is all forest and all kinds of rivers and lakes that are coming off of this, the beginning of the Mississippi River. And just in the driving there from Minneapolis, St. Paul to northern Minnesota, we crossed the Mississippi multiple times. And some of us actually went to the headwaters of the Mississippi and actually saw the very beginning of the Mississippi River, and so really got a sense of the what was threatened by this pipeline. And we also joined, those of us in Washington, D.C., joined many of the protests in Washington, D.C. as well. There were protests at the Army Corps of Engineers because they had the ability to issue a permit or to stop a permit for the pipeline. There were lots of petitions to President Biden. In the end, the pipeline was completed and oil is now flowing through. And but the resistance still continues to monitor and to speak out of any kind of leaks or any kind of problems with the pipeline and make sure that people are aware of any harms that come from this pipeline that was allowed to be built. So again, this is kind of an example of a short-term call of people of faith to join with not having to go live with the folks, but being called to go up and pray with them and be with them at a pivotal moment in their struggle. And the final example I want to give is our global church. And some of you may remember that 3 years ago in October of 2019, the church invited bishops and other church leaders from around the world, but particularly in the Amazon region of South America, to the Vatican to have a whole conversation about the future of this very important ecosystem for our planet. As you probably know, the Amazon has been called the lungs of our planet, where so much of carbon emissions are sequestered, and indigenous peoples who have been guarding this very, very important ecosystem are now under threat. And there's been a very much acceleration of deforestation in the Amazon region. So in a historic first, The Vatican actually didn't just invite cardinals and bishops to this synod. They also invited indigenous leaders. You had a lot of indigenous leaders who were invited to the synod. I would happen to be in Italy for another meeting of the Laudato Si movement, so I stayed for a couple extra days and was actually able to participate in a beautiful Way of the Cross procession that led to St. Peter's Square, as you see here. And we prayed about the different martyrs of the Amazon, including Sister Dorothy Stang and others who have spoken up and gave their lives in defending human rights defenders, indigenous peoples in the Amazon and the ecosystem itself. And you may remember also this, this figure of the pregnant woman that you see in this kind of bottom left of the photo became very controversial. There was some very conservative, I would say, right-wing Catholics who were aghast at this symbol. They thought it was irreverent. They thought it was idolatrous. They thought it was scandalous. And there was an incident in Rome where somebody stole this image and threw it into the river there in Rome. It was just terrible desecration, and just shows some of the opposition to our indigenous brothers and sisters and the ways that they live their spirituality and the way that they so beautifully and so fully embrace Pachamama, Mother Earth, the environment in so many ways, including in their spirituality. The group, if they're in the Amazon, there's a group called RIPAM, and that is actually a Catholic Church supported network of church leaders and indigenous leaders that has been, that ahead of the Amazon Synod was engaging in a lot of conversations at the grassroots levels and really bringing out all the concerns of the people of the Amazon. And they brought out a lot of what came in the media a lot was about the question about married priests and women church leaders. But really a lot of the conversation at the grassroots was around the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, the preservation of indigenous cultures, the violence that they're experiencing as people come in and illegally deforest the land. And we did have some of the folks from the indigenous leaders and some of the bishops and so forth from the Amazon came to Washington, D.C. And here you can see them in a meeting with Representative Grijalva of Arizona. We set up meetings so that they could talk with members of Congress. And then we had some educational forums that you can see here in Washington, D.C. So again, another example in this case, of kind of a real, really innovative and unique church indigenous leader movement to bring to the concerns of the people of the Amazon and the preservation of that ecosystem to our attention. So I'll just leave it there. That's kind of my overview of our theological reflection process, and then just some examples of ways that we as Sisters of Mercy and we as Catholics in our church have engaged in this concept of solidarity and accompaniment, and love to just hear any questions you might have, hear any of your own experiences around accompaniment and solidarity, and just engage in some conversation here. And I will put in the chat the link to our theological reflection program.
Marianne, thank you so much. That was wonderful. My question is, how do we get more adoption of the importance of these climate efforts? I mean, even at Holy Trinity, there's a small committed group of people focused on the green team. When I was in El Paso last week, one church we visited had a really strong commitment to environmentalism. Another one, is not on their radar at all. So I'm just I don't know how to increase adoption across Catholics of this? Do you have any
Yeah,
idea?
it's
How do you, I
very-
mean, you guys seem pretty engaged on it. So how did that work?
Yeah, I think one thing that, as Sisters of Mercy, we are just going with the assumption that most of our sisters are already very engaged and very aware and want to take action. I mean, that's not true across the board. And like in any group, we have folks who are not engaged, but in general, we as a congregation are very committed to climate action. And so we act out of that space. So we're not in the position as many others are of trying to convince people, at least in our own immediate network, to engage. But that being said, certainly in my role with the Laudato Si movement, in the Catholic Climate Covenant, and in the Archdiocesan of Washington Care for Creation Committee, we're very much talking about these things. And a couple things. One is we know for sure that talking about facts about climate change is not helpful. That has been, the science of climate change has been, out there for a long time, is there for anybody to look at. And if people haven't been moved by that scientific data, they're not going to be. So really, what we're hearing is that there's two ways that seem to be really shifting the narrative. One is talking about experiences, talking about the people who are most harmed from climate change, which includes making the connections to things that we're seeing in the news. So making the connections to Hurricane Ian and all the devastation in Florida, and how scientists are telling us that they can't pinpoint that any particular hurricane is caused by climate change, but they can say that climate change in general is making the oceans more hot, more warm or hotter. And so that is creating stronger storms. And so, just saying that we know that climate change is creating conditions for greater storms. And here we're having the devastation, and just making that link. And I'm really pleased to see that more and more weather forecasters are doing that you're hearing, used to be, people just talk about these hurricanes, but now you're seeing that meteorologists are taking it upon themselves to make that connection, which is really great. So I think, talking about stories, sharing stories, making the connection of what people are seeing, that this is climate change. The second thing that we're hearing a lot about is health professionals are talking about the harms in climate change, be it from, we're going to be seeing more malaria and, insect-borne diseases are going to be moving further north, or we're going to be seeing more people suffering from heat exhaustion. When we were in northern Minnesota in early June, it was 90s. I mean, they have never seen that in northern Minnesota. I mean, it was incredible. I had to go to the hospital at 10 o'clock at night with one of my friends who was with me because she was suffering from heat exhaustion, and we were told she had to go to the hospital to get rehydrated intravenously. So that the public health aspects seem to be messaging. So sharing experiences and talking about the health impacts seem to be getting through. And then I think giving hope. I think one of the obstacles to talking about climate change is that I really believe there's not climate denial so much as there's climate fear. People are afraid to really acknowledge what's happening because then they're like going to feel hopeless and they're going to feel awful and they don't want to feel that way. So if we can make the connection when we're talking about the stronger storms, we're talking about the health impacts, and then at the same time, talk about things people can do. So they feel they have some agency, they feel they have some hope. And, having like right now, the Catholic Climate Covenant has a petition to the Biden administration to ask them to take some really concrete steps when they're at the international climate talks in Egypt next month. Giving people concrete things that they can do to have an impact. Annie?
Going along with hope, a friend in Fort Myers 3 years ago started very small in an assisted living place, weaving plastic bags, that you get in the store from Giant, and weaving them into mats that they sent to Africa to put on the ground when people were in tents, to just make it a little easier on them in terms of dampness. And because that group was already interested, now when this Ian came, she said the response has been terrific, and they're going around telling people that the cleanup is $63 billion, because a lot of them are rich. And when they see that this cleanup is costing so much money. So my point is that there's many ways that people get involved in this climate crisis, but it can be incremental, starting small and then growing.
I love that example. That's great. Ella?
Elia,
Elia, sorry.
wondering if the Inter-American Human Rights Commission has been successful in doing something about the Panamanian situation.
Yeah, so they had a hearing, and it was really interesting. I listened into it. My Spanish is not great, but because it was in Spanish, but I was able to follow enough. And what was really telling is you had, all these indigenous people in a room, and they were sharing their concerns. And then you had the government people in a room, and then you had this guy who was supposed to be the ombudsman, between the indigenous, the communities and the government. And he was in the same room as the government. So the Inter-American Human Rights Commission was really honing in on that. Like, why are you in the same office with the government? Are you supposed to be an ombudsman? And are we understanding, like, what are you actually doing? And they really honed in on that. It was really interesting. Now, what they actually, I don't know if they've issued a report yet from that particular hearing, but in general, and you may know more about this, Elia, because you posed this question, but in general, what we find is that the Human Rights Commission, it's more of a raising of awareness and having governments understand that they're being watched, that people are watching them, than actually being able to get them to change things or take specific action. So in that particular case, in the hearing itself, they were really urging the government to do some more consultation with the communities, really trying to get them to have more connection and hear the experience of the indigenous communities. So that seemed to be the role in that particular case. But I don't know, Elia, have you had experience with the Human Rights Commission before?
Years ago, yes. And they're very good. So my question also is there a follow-up to this hearing?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go back and see, and I will let Ashley know what I find out if there was a report, because usually there is some kind of report, but it can be sometimes a ways after the actual hearing. So I'll see if there has been a report, and if so, if we can get some of the summary of that to see what actually happened with that.
Thank you.
Sure. It did seem like the indigenous peoples were not totally satisfied with the hearing, because there were a couple of women who came back to the US a couple months later and were hoping to get another meeting. So that says to me that there was something that was missing there, but I can get a little more details on that. Like I said, my Spanish isn't really great, so I'm a little challenged in getting all that feedback.
Going back to Ashley's question, a little bit building on that, you gave some good examples of what works and doesn't work. So at a parish level, would it be possible, what do you think of the idea of focusing on an issue, meeting with people, taking their stories, health impacts, that sort of thing, giving hope, and incorporating that with mini parish adapted version of the cycle of awakening to a new consciousness. Now we have Ignatian spirituality already and retreats and all, but is there some way, do you think that could be, those could be integrated?
Absolutely. I mean, we would be happy for anybody to use whatever's useful from our resources. And, you know, I would venture to say that in any community, you can find examples of the harms of extractives. I mean, certainly here in DC, you know, we know that there are communities that are facing different kinds of environmental injustices that we can point to that could be part of the deep listening part. You know, and if as you're part of the larger Jesuit community, the Jesuits certainly have been really involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and looking at the boarding schools. And they have schools in a couple of different Native American reservations. And so I think, you know, I think it's really powerful to find the stories that connect to your community. So if you have stories that come from, you know, your parish community or from your larger community, be it Jesuit, Franciscan, or the region of a country that you're in, the closer geographically you can find the stories, the more relevant and more connected people will feel to them. And then applying that deep listening, deep reflection, and deep transformation.
Good tip. Thank you. Anyone else have questions, please?
I just have a quick comment, and thank you, Marianne, for your words. The Catholic Climate Covenant newsletter is that if you're not on the email list for that, to do that. It just has so many resources and so much information that I just really appreciate what Catholic Climate Covenant is doing.
Yeah, they're really doing great work. And I would recommend too, if for those of you who aren't aware of it, the Laudato Si Action Platform, which is the Vatican's, I see some nodding heads, which is the Vatican's 7-year initiative for us all to live Laudato Si more fully. And you can sign up as a parish and kind of track your progress as you work on the 7 goals that are outlined there. The website is laudatosiactionplatform.org. And you can, you know, have all kinds of resources. You can sign up as a family. You can sign up as an individual. So there's all different ways that you can engage in that. And I think having something, you know, a lot of people having something that the Vatican is inviting the whole world into is quite a great incentive, like the sense of like we're all, you know, my parish is now engaging with the whole rest of the Catholic world. It's pretty exciting. I know that our the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, we have signed up and we've engaged. And part of the beauty for us, which I'm sure would be true for a lot of groups, including parishes, is that we're doing a lot of things. You know, we're doing a lot of things, and participating in this platform isn't necessarily having us do new things or more things, but it's kind of a narrative. It's kind of putting together how we're responding to the cry of the earth, how we're responding to the cry of the poor, how are we engaging in ecological spirituality, and creating a narrative that all these different things that everybody's doing all come together to be living Laudato Si more fully. And I would imagine that, you know, most parishes, you know, if they really gave a lot of thought to the work that they're already doing, could see that you've already at least started the journey. We're all in different places, but there's already some things that you've done around these areas. And then it's kind of a natural process of seeing what's the next things that we can do that build on what we've already done. And that kind of is like the natural progression of the 7 years of just kind of building on what we've done till we can get to a place where we've really made a big impact, you know, collectively as a Catholic Church by adding up all these different actions.
Hello, I have a question, Marianne. What do you think? The way I see it and what I hear from you is that, you know, scientists agree we have a problem. It's kind of an emergency, but there is hope. Now, if the information is there, as you say, and the facts are there, and there is no need to insist on that because it's kind of obvious, and the people that see it and believe it, there are some that believe it strongly and some that have doubts and some that wouldn't believe it anyway. So what we need is like a movement, and that's what the Catholic Church is doing, and some other previous NGOs like the Sierra Club and some others have been doing for a long time. Now, my question is the following: how do you see that Catholic parishes funds are being used in lobbying activist efforts? Because usually we focus on projects, little things here and there, but little things here and there, that's my belief, don't have a lot of impact, because what we need now is the joint effort of companies, the industry, government, and people. And that's it. The people that are going to be there, they are there already, and there will be some few that we can, the true information get, but what we need is a movement. And usually those NGOs that work in those movements are big and work with the whole world, and which in parishes usually we want to work with the local community. And that's the issue, because the local community is thinking about, picking up garbage, it's not, I'm not talking about, like, I don't appreciate that, but that's very small effort, what we can do individually. Of course, we have to do it. So what do you think about that? Because in using Persian funds, because this is a global problem, and the main problem is produced by the big countries like the United States, all Americans, Europeans, not really. And the impacts, of course, we are having impact now, but most of the impacts are in developing countries. Now, there are things that are going to happen pretty soon. For instance, Italy is producing coffee now in Sicilia. They are planning to produce their own coffee and export it to Europe. Think about Colombia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and all the countries that produce coffee. What is going to happen in immigration? It's just that I think we have to think globally, not locally, in issues of environment. Because poverty, environment for me, and natural resource management and climate change all together, they are completely interdependent, on immigration. And youth at the same time, because just to hear those generations see and those people, why am I going to study? Why am I going to work so much? They do quiet quitting, anyway, the earth is going to melt, the loans for college will be $1 million to pay afterwards. So what's the point? Is this the kind of discouragement? So I think for me, the main issue is that thing of environment, because it's like it supersedes everything. So that's my question. How do you feel about Catholics being involved in such a global thing and using the funds? And because when I'm thinking about giving money to my parish, I also have the resources are limited, and you think, well, there is Sierra Club, this thing, they are doing this, they are doing that, and all, and this, you have to take those decisions. There's an opportunity cost. And I think all parishioners are thinking the same thing, it's just that.
Yeah, so let me, I totally appreciate your point that yes, we need to be looking at the bigger picture and engaging and basically engaging in advocacy in addition to the projects versus advocacy. So I put in the chat, the Catholic Climate Covenant has this petition to the Biden administration, trying to get lots and lots of Catholics to sign on this petition to urge the Biden administration to take really bold steps at the international climate talks in Egypt next month. So that's one thing you could do. The other thing is to look, depending on where you live, is looking at what is happening, where there's some advocacy you can do at the state level. So in Maryland, where I am and where my parish is, we were getting really frustrated that the Maryland Catholic Conference wasn't doing anything on the environment. Every year they would pick their top things. It was always, about school choice, and it was usually about, a poverty issue, maybe something about abortion or something. And we, for a couple of years, were trying to push them to add the environment. We said, okay, we can't wait for them. So we got a bunch of churches in Maryland that we got together, and we said, we're just going to do it ourselves. We're going to organize people at the Catholic parishes in Maryland. We gave ourselves a name, Maryland Catholics for a Common Home. And we organized a whole gathering in Annapolis. This was in February of 2018. And we had a prayer service. We had an educational program about climate change and the bill that was was in before the Maryland legislature. And then people went and met with their members of the legislature. It was like a lobby night. And then people wrote petitions. 2019, we did the same thing. 2020, we were ready to do the same thing, but then COVID broke out. So we kind of shifted to lots of letters and campaigning. So we did that for about 3 years. And then then we kept meeting with the Maryland Catholic Conference. And last year they did adopt a climate bill. They did add a climate bill to their list of things they were advocating on. So sometimes our advocacy is within our own church, getting our own church to take action and and leverage their influence and power. So I think that doing, kind of advocacy in both those spaces, I would really suggest that at a parish, if you have a green team, you make sure members of the green team are getting emails from the Catholic Climate Covenant, from the Sierra Club, what have you. And then when there's a really important action, like signing a petition, see if you're allowed to do like a petition or a letter writing thing at the after mass, can you do that? If that is problematic in your parish, get email addresses of people, and you can send emails to people in the parish and ask them to sign a petition or write a letter to their state or national officials. So I think kind of pairing the projects that people feel they're doing something, whether it's recycling or whatever, the projects, and pairing it with the advocacy to tell people, this is great that we're recycling. It's great that we're doing a parish cleanup this Saturday. At the same time, we have to look at the bigger issues globally, and here's a way you can address that as well. So hopefully that gives you some ideas for engaging. And if any of you are in Maryland, we'll be Maryland Catholics for a Common Home will be coming up with our top bills that we're going to be advocating on. And we'll be communicating that early in the session in January.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
If there are no more questions, I want to thank Marianne for giving us encouragement and a lot of information and ideas, things we should reflect on and pray about raising our own game and how we might go, directions we might go. So appreciate it very much.
Great being with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
delightful. And, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the evening.